my name is Vedika. Okay, wait, yeah, the notification just came. Okay, I'll try again. Namaste, my name is Vedika Chamaria, and today I'll be discussing a very intriguing yet relevant topic based on my Waves 2024 paper titled Are There Ethics in War? A Vedic Perspective. We'll explore how ancient Vedic civilizations approached war and the ethical codes they followed, comparing these principles to modern international human law today. So there are several common myths about ancient Indian history. A survey of existing history books will convince you that number one, the Indus Valley may not have been our ancestors and they have nothing in common with today's India, not even language. The second myth is that in 1500 BCE, hordes of illiterate Aryans, no, scratch that, Aryans that migrated, removed all traces of intelligence, science, philosophy, and astronomy from the locals. They then say that Greeks in the 14th century BCE and later the Islamic invaders came and gave India philosophy, math, science. They came and they brought us culture. And then finally, only in about 500 CE did India get back on its feet. This research explores the ancient Indian war ethics, focusing on the justification for war, or jus ad bellum, and conduct during war, jus in bello. Using sources like the Vedas, Ramayana, and Mahabharata, we examine the ethical codes and conducts during conflicts and how these principles influenced modern war standards today. So diving straight into what we found. We saw that Vedic literature, specifically the Rig Veda, mentions four upayas, or ways to deal with conflict. Number one suggests sama, which calls for serious attempts at reconciliation based on negotiation and compromise. The second way is to pay a price, and that's called dana. It does not just cover donation, but it also covers giving away something that is precious to each side, such as land, money, assets. The idea is to just keep the cost of war in terms of loss of property and not in terms of loss of life. The third technique, the Bheda technique, involves confusing the enemy camp or even deceiving them with some sort of propaganda. And the number four is war using force to correct the imbalance or the anyaya, the unjust situation, which is mentioned as the last resort to resolve any sort of dispute. In the Vedas, there are two types of wars that are mentioned in detail. There's Dharma Yudh, which is a war based on righteousness and fairness. And then there's those based on adharmic principles or non-righteous principles called Kuta Yuddha. In Dharma Yudh specifically, in ancient kingdoms, there were many shastras which laid down the code of conduct for the monarch, the administration, and the state. There were also dharma gurus who were well versed in the dharmic or righteous principles to be followed in keeping peace and avoiding conflict. Dharmic principles were well discussed, debated, and understood by all sides because war was only to be declared against unrighteous parties. Serious efforts at negotiation to prevent war were suggested and practiced. We can see examples in Ramayana via Hanuman's ambassador trip to Lanka or Krishna's moratorium of a few days to negotiate a peaceful settlement, which unfortunately ended up failing. Only legitimized violence to cause better outcomes for the greater good were considered righteous. So let's take a moment to compare the scale of ethical conduct in the Mahabharata and World War II, which was the largest war of the modern era. During World War II, 55 million civilians died, making up a significant portion of the 80 million total deaths. In the Mahabharata, an ancient war that lasted only 18 days, while all 4 million soldiers perished, there was not a single civilian casualty. The Mahabharata War was the world's largest war ever. Out of a total world population of 20 million at the time, with 5 million men and 5 million women living in around India, 4 million men took part in the war and almost all of them perished, but not even a single innocent civilian was harmed. As a side note, it's been observed that because the Mahabharata war was so big and so vast, there was no significant war for millennia afterwards because of the impact it had on the population. World War II was clearly only a distant second when it comes to the largest war ever in the history of humanity, but it still compares nowhere near to the scale of the Mahabharata. So during the war, the Mahabharata prescribed a clear set of ethical guidelines for conduct. Warriors were required to engage in combat with equals, meaning one-on-one combat with the same weapons. So a charioteer who drove the warrior or a mahout who guided the elephant were off limits and they couldn't be attacked. An infantry person could only fight another infantry person. An unarmed person couldn't be attacked. An injured person, those who were in combat, onlookers, women, children, all of these people were protected under the law. It was forbidden to attack someone who had lost their armor and those who were wounded or surrendered. There was also restrictions on mounted soldiers attacking foot soldiers or vice versa. After a war ended, there was also ethical guidelines on how the victors should behave. Social structures and state administration were left intact, and the defeated king was often reinstated. Regular life assumed under the rule of law, with the victors refraining from any sort of unnecessary violence. Importantly, women and children were not harmed, and efforts were made to restore peace and stability in the conquered territories. In today's war, we often see burning, pillaging, ravaging, raping, killing. All of these war crimes and atrocities are committed even after the war has been won. And for what? During the Ramayana, there was a large war that took place in Sri Lanka and a few smaller ones prior to that. Dharma gurus and councils of ministers advised the monarch at each step. Many examples exist of strict adherence to Dharma Yuddha principles all over the conflicts mentioned in Ramayana. This slide just shows a few of the examples of the righteous behavior during the Dharma Yuddha. The Mahabharata War is the world's largest war ever. So in this backdrop of a mostly righteous war, there were still some incidences or some indiscretions that are listed in this slide. The most discussed one is the killing of Bhishma by Arjuna, on the advice of Sri Krishna. Bhishma was on the Kaurava side and he was wreaking havoc to the Pandava side. He was also aware of the unrighteous acts of the people on his side. He himself gave the Pandavas a hint on how to defeat himself, and this was confirmed by Sri Krishna as a way to dispose of Bhishma, which was critical for the righteous side or the Pandavas to win. While the method used by Arjuna is often discussed as not so righteous, it was blessed by Bhishma himself and was the biggest Dharma guru of all time, Sri Krishna, which made it okay. So as we just saw, out of the many just acts during the large war, there were definitely a few acts that were unjust. No matter what their justification was, the following must be noted. All sides disapproved of all the unjust acts, including the side who actually committed them. So in the case that Pandava committed an unjust act, it was condemned from their side as well. The sides repented and admitted their mistake, and they were ashamed. Number 3, out of control, and once the initial unjust act was made, every side would try to commit an even bigger unjust act to undo the impact of the first one. So the key ones, like the killing of Bhishma, were seen as a legitimate act of violence, and they were considered okay because it was the only way for the righteous side to win, and it was for the good of society. And again, reminding everyone that out of the many thousands of righteous acts in the war, there were few indiscretions far and in between. The level of attention that was paid to wars and the conflicts being fought justly was very high during the Vedic period and most of the post-Vedic period. Then came the Maurya dynasty with Kautilya and Chanakya as its key minister, and they wrote a Dharma manual, the Arthashastra. Rules of Dharma Yuddha were thrown out the door, especially the ones related to jus ad bellum, righteous reasons to go into war. But the rules that were still followed during the war were dharmic and righteous. Chanakya was a student at Takshashila along with Chandragupta Maurya, who was an ignored stepchild of the Mauryan dynasty. Chanakya noticed that the invading Greeks were winning away and they would devour all of India if they were not stopped. So they realized that in order to stop the chaos and to be powerful enough to beat the Greeks, they had to have some sort of strategy, and they had to go into war using whatever means they could. So after the Gupta period, foreign invaders that did not follow these rules or ethics, they came in waves. We had Indian kings that realized that they could not survive if they followed the good old Dharma Yuddha principles because the invaders that they were fighting with were not following these same principles. This was the only way to preserve our culture, religion, and prevent women and children from getting enslaved. When searching for ethical principles outside India, we found that there were some mentioned by Saint Augustine in the 5th century CE. In the 13th century CE, Thomas Aquinas built on St. Augustine's just war theory, and he wrote about it. Scholars have noted, though, that both of these two based their just war theory on biblical content, and the two Latin terms may feel like they were coined a long time ago and they're very ancient, but on the contrary, they were first coined in the League of Nations only recently in 1920. It's hardly been 100 years since they were first introduced. And they were not put into practice until after this world's second largest war, right? World War II. So it didn't even have a huge impact. So Dorn did a large study in 2015 where they surveyed over 100 international study experts. They used a just war index to gauge their perspectives on some key wars of the 20th century, and these wars were considered unjust wars, both the reasons to get into war and the way that they were actually fought. As you can see in these slides, these wars were considered just and fair. Most of Europe's wars happened before the coining of the two large terms that we saw before, just in bello and jus in bello. So these wars were based on unjust reasons like imperial goals, taking over neighboring land, religious wars like the ones between the Roman Catholics and the Church. So they were considered just wars because they were for a better reason. So let's explore the comparison between Dharmayuddha principles and modern day international human law, or IHL. So in ancient Indian texts like the Arthashastra, it was emphasized that the rights of the defeated population, ensuring their social structures and customs, were preserved. This was a very important part of our Dharmayuddha, similar to modern protections for prisoners of war under the Geneva Conventions. However, ancient India went further, explicitly safeguarding cultural practices, something that's not directly covered by the modern IHL that we see today. In the Rig Veda, rules of combat prohibited striking from behind, attacking women or children or the elderly, and it required that the combat be between equals. While IHL does protect civilians, it lacks specific provisions about equal combat. There's no rule that foot soldiers have to fight foot soldiers, or soldiers fighting in the air have to fight other soldiers in the air. Similarly, the Ramayana forbade harming diplomats, a concept that is echoed today in the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations. One key distinction is that Dharmayuddha prioritized cultural preservation post-war and pre-war, as well as during war, ensuring that the vanquished could maintain their way of life, a principle that is not emphasized at all in modern international human law today. Thus, while IHL developed recently, ancient Indian war ethics were already addressing these moral issues thousands of years ago with a lot more specificity. So, ancient India, possibly from the 14th century BCE up to first millennium BCE, developed an advanced and strict ethical framework surrounding warfare far ahead of its time. These codes covered not only the justification for war, but also how war should be conducted and the treatment of the defeated. Long before Europe humanitarian laws, Indian civilization, as early as the Ramayana and Mahabharata, adhered to that these were, such as the IHL, which are contained in the four Geneva Conventions of 1949. In the 37th shloka of chapter 2 of Bhagavad Gita, it is said that Hato va prapsyasi svargam jitva va bhokryase mahim Tasmaduttishta kaunteya yuddhaya. Krishna says that for the sake of in a righteous war, a dharma yudh, it's important to note that the Indians did not shy away from war when it was necessary. That was the important part. It had to be necessary. With the influx of invaders from the west, Indian kings had to first give up jus ad bellum principles, as seen during Chanakya's times, and then eventually jus in bello principles as well. Today, as modern conflicts continue to challenge the ethical limits of warfare, revisiting these ancient guidelines from the Vedic scriptures could inspire new approaches to balancing military necessity along with the humanitarian concerns that we face. The timeless wisdom that's embedded in the Dharmayuddha reminds us that even in war, there is always a place for justice and for humanity. Dhanyavad. And then this is a QR code to access the full paper.